Iranian ballistic missiles destroyed Israel's National Power Grid Coordination Center 18 minutes ago. Not a substation, not a regional distribution hub, not one node in a network that can reroute around a single point of failure. The Coordination Center, the facility that every power generation source in Israel's national grid, the remaining solar farms, the backup diesel generation clusters, the emergency hospital feeds, the water pumping relays that were keeping the last treatment facility operational, depended on as the single nerve center routing electricity to every critical system still functioning in the country. A facility that once destroyed does not leave a degraded grid behind it. It leaves no grid, because a power grid without its coordination center is not a grid operating at reduced capacity. It is 4 million individually isolated endpoints with no mechanism connecting generation to consumption, and no pathway through which any of it reaches the hospitals, the emergency shelters, the pumping infrastructure, or the civilian population that needed it running this morning. This was not a strike designed to cut power to a city. It was a strike designed to sever the single point through which all power in the country was still being organized and distributed. The difference is not technical. It is absolute. Cutting power to a city creates a blackout that can be reversed when the line is repaired or the substation is restored. Destroying the coordination center creates a condition where there is nothing to restore the power through, even if every generation source in the country remained fully intact and operational, which they do not. The grid is not dark. The grid is gone, and in the next few minutes I am going to show you exactly what the destruction of a National Grid Coordination Center means for the infrastructure that was already operating at its absolute limit. Why this strike is categorically different from every previous power infrastructure attack in this conflict. What the Israeli government has and has not communicated to the 9 million people who went to sleep last night, assuming the emergency systems keeping them alive would still be running this morning. What a civilian population with no grid, no coordination infrastructure, and no restoration pathway faces in the hours and days ahead. And why the missile strike on Israel's National Power Coordination Center is the single most consequential infrastructure attack Iran has executed since this conflict began. Before we get into it, thank you for being here. Your support is what makes this analysis possible, and I genuinely mean that. Make sure you are subscribed and like the video so this reaches the people who need to see it. Now let's get into it. To understand why the missile strike on the National Power Grid Coordination Center is categorically different from every previous power infrastructure strike in this conflict, you need to understand what a coordination center is and why destroying it produces consequences that no previous strike on generation capacity, transmission lines, or regional substations has produced. A power grid is not a single system. It is a collection of generation sources, transmission pathways, distribution networks, and consumption endpoints that function as a unified system only because a coordination center is continuously managing the flow of electricity between every component simultaneously. Generation without coordination is electricity with nowhere to go. Transmission without coordination is infrastructure carrying current that no endpoint can receive at the voltage and frequency it requires. Distribution without coordination is a network of lines connecting nothing to nothing. The coordination center is not one component of the grid. It is the component that makes every other component functional. Without it, the grid does not operate at reduced capacity. It does not operate at all. And that distinction between a grid that is degraded and a grid that is dissolved is the entire difference between a power crisis and a power absence. That distinction is what makes this strike categorically different from every power infrastructure strike that came before it. A strike on a generation facility reduces output, some generation is lost, the remainder continues, and the grid operates at diminished but real capacity. A strike on a transmission line severs one pathway. Current reroutes through alternative pathways, and the grid absorbs the disruption with degraded but continuing function. A strike on a regional substation blacks out a defined geographic area while leaving the surrounding grid intact and operational. Each of those strikes creates a crisis that engineers can respond to, that spare capacity can compensate for, that repair timelines can address. The coordination center strike creates none of those conditions, because you cannot reroute around the destruction of the system that performs the rerouting. You cannot compensate with spare capacity when the facility that allocates capacity to endpoints no longer exists. You cannot put engineers on a repair timeline when what needs to be repaired is not a damaged component, but the entire coordination architecture that every other component in the grid depended on to function. The grid is not degraded. The grid is dissolved. Every generation source in the country is producing electricity that has no coordinated pathway to the endpoints that need it. Every hospital, every emergency shelter, every water pumping relay, every backup system that was keeping critical infrastructure operational this morning is now drawing on whatever stored power its local backup systems contain. And local backup systems are not indefinite. They are finite. They are measured in hours, not in the days and weeks that restoration of a destroyed coordination center requires. Now let us talk about what the sequential failure of systems that depended on grid power produces. Because the destruction of the coordination center does not create one crisis. It creates a cascade of crises triggered in sequence, as each system exhausts the backup power that was its only remaining buffer against the grid going down. The water pumping infrastructure is the first cascade point. The pumping relays that were moving water through the distribution network to the civilian population ran on grid power. When grid power went down, they switched to backup. Backup is not indefinite. When the pumping relays exhaust their backup power, the water stops moving through the pipes, regardless of whether any treatment capacity remains elsewhere in the system. The water that is currently in pipes is the water that exists. When it is consumed, there is no mechanism to move more water through the network to replace it. The second cascade point is the hospital backup generation systems. Hospitals switched to generator power when the grid first came under attack in this conflict. Those generators have been running continuously since. Generators require fuel. Fuel requires resupply through logistics chains that are operating in a conflict zone with a closed airport and supply routes under sustained pressure. The generators that are keeping dialysis machines, surgical theaters, intensive care units, and life support systems operational are not running on an indefinite fuel supply. They are running on whatever fuel was prepositioned and whatever resupply has been able to reach them through a logistics environment that was already at its absolute limit before the coordination center was destroyed. The third cascade point is communications infrastructure. The cellular networks, the emergency broadcast systems, the coordination infrastructure that civil defense depends on to direct the civilian population through a crisis runs on power. Backup power, finite backup power that is now the only source keeping those systems operational. When communications infrastructure begins failing sequentially as backup systems exhaust, the government loses its mechanism for directing 9 million people through what has just happened. 9 million people without power, without water, without the communications infrastructure that was their only remaining source of guidance, facing cascading infrastructure failure with no reliable information and no pathway back. The civilian population's immediate situation is not a power outage. It is a simultaneous removal of every system that grid power was sustaining at the precise moment when every one of those systems was already operating at its maximum emergency capacity with no redundancy remaining. Before this strike, the population was managing. Not comfortably, not safely, but managing. Emergency systems were functioning. Hospitals were treating casualties. Water was moving through pipes. Backup generators were keeping critical nodes alive. Managing is a condition that requires the systems doing the managing to remain operational. The moment the coordination center was destroyed, every system that was doing the managing began its countdown to the moment its backup power runs out. And there is no reset. There is no restoration of grid coordination on any timeline that changes the situation for the 9 million people whose survival depends on the systems that grid power was sustaining. The power coordination center is gone. The cascade it has triggered is already running. And the population that was managing this morning is not managing anymore. It is waiting for systems to fail one by one. The Israeli government's communication to its civilian population about the destruction of the National Power Grid Coordination Center has followed the same pattern that has characterized every previous infrastructure failure communication in this conflict. Silence. There has been no public acknowledgement of what the destruction of a coordination center does to a power grid that a strike on a generation facility or a substation does not. There has been no honest assessment of the restoration timeline communicated to the 9 million people who are now living on whatever backup power their local systems contain. There has been no updated civil defense guidance reflecting a situation where the grid is not degraded but dissolved, and where the systems that emergency guidance assumed would remain operational are now on countdown clocks measured in hours. The civil defense framework that was telling civilians to shelter in place, to rely on emergency communications, to trust that hospital systems would remain functional, was designed for a crisis in which infrastructure was damaged. It was not designed for a situation in which the coordination architecture that underpins every piece of infrastructure simultaneously no longer exists. The civilians following that guidance this morning are following instructions that were accurate yesterday and are dangerously misleading today. The international response to the destruction of Israel's National Power Grid Coordination Center is being shaped by the same calculus that has governed every previous Allied response to Iranian infrastructure strikes in this conflict, only the numbers have changed and not in a direction that Allied governments can manage with the frameworks they have been using. Every previous strike produced a crisis that had a visible restoration pathway. Damaged facilities could be repaired. Destroyed substations could be replaced. The international community could point to timelines and engineering solutions and emergency logistics as evidence that the situation was manageable. The Coordination Center strike produces no visible restoration pathway. There is no emergency replacement for a national grid coordination center on any timeline that matters to 9 million people whose backup systems are measured in hours. The Allied governments that have been managing their domestic publics with the language of crisis and recovery are now managing a situation for which the language of recovery does not apply on any relevant timeline. That is a political problem that no Allied government has a prepared answer for, because no Allied government planned for a scenario in which every layer of critical infrastructure in a country of 9 million people was sequentially destroyed to the point where the last coordination mechanism holding the remaining systems together was eliminated in a single strike. The open question that the destruction of Israel's National Power Grid Coordination Center leaves hanging over this conflict is not a military question, it is not a strategic question. It is the same question that the destruction of the last water plant raised, now compounded with an intensity that no single infrastructure failure could produce alone. A population without water survives for days. A population without power loses the systems that were managing the water absence, the hospital functions, the communications that were keeping civil order intact, the heating and cooling that the most medically vulnerable people in the country depend on to survive. The compounding of water absence and power dissolution does not add two crises together. It multiplies their consequences against each other. And the government that has been managing each crisis individually as it emerged is now managing a situation in which the crises are no longer individual. They are simultaneous. They are reinforcing. And the biological clock that started running the moment the coordination center was destroyed is not running on a military timeline or a diplomatic timeline or an engineering timeline. It runs on the timeline that 9 million people's bodies impose on it. That timeline does not negotiate. It does not wait for ceasefires or humanitarian corridors or emergency logistics to catch up. It runs. The open question that the destruction of Israel's National Power Grid Coordination Center leaves hanging over this conflict and over every government watching it is not a military question or a strategic question. It is a human question. How long can a civilian population of 9 million people sustain itself when the power is gone, the water is gone, the hospitals are running on finite backup fuel, and the communications infrastructure guiding them through the crisis is on its own countdown clock? The answer is not measured in the weeks and months that military campaigns are typically measured in. It is measured in hours, and the government that has been managing this conflict in military and strategic timeframes is now managing a situation operating on a biological timeline that no military or strategic decision-making framework was built to address. Iran destroyed the coordination center, the lights have gone out, and the clock that began running the moment that strike hit is not a military clock, it is a human one. Thanks for watching. I appreciate you here. Drop your thoughts below. Iran struck the coordination center rather than another generation facility or substation. What does that target selection tell you about how precisely Iran had mapped the single point of failure in Israel's remaining power architecture before it fired? And at what point does a government managing the simultaneous absence of power, water, airport connectivity, and external military support have an obligation to tell its 9 million civilians not what it wants them to hear, but what the biological timeline they are now operating on actually requires them to do? Let me know below, subscribe, and like the video if you want to stay updated on this. Click this video on screen to see another. I will see you soon.